Welcome back to my YouTube channel, Captain Boat Builder. This is episode 16, part 2. Part 1 in the painting of the outside of the hull was mostly sanding and the use of primer to get a smooth surface. Part 2 is mostly about applying the finish coats, and thankfully I can say that with the painting the outside of the boat, I am finished. A couple of points I'd like to mention, and I will just refer to my notes here to refresh myself. The first thing that I wanted to mention was especially obvious when I started painting all this white. I got to the point where it was very hard to actually tell where I had been because I'd been looking at white paint so much I couldn't tell the new white paint from the old white paint, even though after the sanding the old stuff, the old surface looks a little bit dull. What I realized is that you need, at least I do, you need a tremendous amount of light to help you with this process of figuring out just exactly where you are. And I would recommend as much light as you can possibly get, and also that you use a pure bright white as opposed to anything that's incandescent or slightly amber. The second point that I wanted to make, this is a little bit of a confession. What I found was that as I started painting more and more, and I thought I was getting more comfortable and getting better, I noticed that I was starting to put the paint on just a little bit thicker. And with this particular paint, putting it on thicker, a thicker coating does not work. It doesn't flow better. It doesn't necessarily cover better. It's much easier for it to run. And the real qualities of this paint that are so desirable, mostly the flowing out and the super slick finish, are based on applying thin coats. So as you get better at doing this, try to resist this temptation to use more paint to get better coverage. That's a mistake that I made. Also with this paint, the use of thinner, the special Interlux thinner, it's called 333. I asked them specifically if you could just thin the paint with mineral spirits, and they said, sort of. And their particular thinner, this Interlux 333, has other materials in it that help the thinning process. So I would recommend buying a small can of thinner so that you can keep thinning the paint and get it just to the consistency that you like. The third thing that I wanted to mention, and I'm more convinced of this than ever, the can will tell you that the recoat time, certainly in 24 hours, you can be sanding and painting again. As with the epoxy, I found that the paint surface sanded much better and much more easily if you wait at least a couple of days in between coats. It allows the paint to get quite hard and it makes it much easier to sand. Unfortunately, this will extend the time on your project. So those are my recommendations at this point, things that I've learned, I think, about the painting process. Again, today's episode will be the painting, the final finish coat white painting of the boat. It's a little slow, but as I've said before, try to stick with me and you'll see at the end a beautiful finished product, which to me was worth it. So I hope you enjoy today's episode, and after the painting, again, as I mentioned before, the next step and the final step for me is varnishing the interior, and strangely that's what I've been looking forward to now for 4 months. So thanks for joining me again today. Here's the boat, obviously right side up. The painting of the hull is finished. And before I get into part 2 of episode 16 about the painting, the final coats of painting, I wanted to show you something that's a simple point. It's very obvious once it's mentioned, but it's something that never would have occurred to me. And I'll have to thank my helper, my advisor at Chesapeake Lightcraft, Terry Otis. I'll have to thank him for pointing this out. Early on, I was trying to decide what color to paint the hull. If you go online, you can see examples of Sassafras 12s that are painted different colors in different videos, and you can also see lots of lapstrake construction boats, which this is, that are painted different colors. What I failed to realize is that when you paint the boat white, like my boat is now, you get very, very sharp shadow lines that follow the strakes as they overlap each other, going down toward the center line of the bottom. And these strakes produce these beautiful sharp shadow lines which accentuate the construction of the boat. And this type of look is absolutely typical of lapstrake construction, and it's what you're interested in. It's what I was interested in. But what I didn't realize, of course, is that when you paint the boat a dark color, say dark blue or black, dark green, something like that, the shadow lines become almost invisible, and so the effect of the lapstraking is not accentuated, and so you lose part of that nice design element. So that, in my mind, that's a good reason to choose white, so that you get these great shadow lines the entire length of the boat. So now we're going to go back and start from the beginning of the painting of the final coat. This is the boat after 2 coats of the finish 1 part polyurethane for the bottom. This is 2 coats of the white. It's still a little bit thin down here in the bow areas where I did some heavy sanding initially. I'm quite pleased with the finish itself. I'll be explaining a few techniques and some of the things that I've learned. It's gone quite well. What I'm going to be doing today as I wait for the paint to dry more before I start sanding it is I'm going to be varnishing the underside of the rail, this edge and this edge, with tape. Be cutting the varnish in against the paint so we get a nice sharp line. And I'm doing all that now because just the underside, because once I turn the boat back over and start varnishing the inside, I don't expect to do any more work on the bottom. So that's my little project for today, and I'll be back with you. This is a quick shot of coat number 3. Again, this is the Interlux Brightside 1 part polyurethane. It continues to get smoother and smoother. I'm learning a little bit as I go. Hope I can share some of those techniques with you. My wife came down and noticed the paint job, and she said, "Why are you spending so much time? Why are you working so hard on this boat, you know, on the bottom? Only the fish can see the bottom." She might have a good point. But this is coat 3. I'm starting to think that 5 coats are going to do it, and I'll be back with you again. Well, folks, continuing on with the endless sanding and painting, I've now finished coat number 4 on the entire boat. It's just about the way I want it. You may be able to see in this picture, it's just a little thin up here in the bow. I'm going to have to put an extra coat or 2 on there and then blend it in. But you can see what the paint job is starting to look like. I'm quite satisfied with it. Well, you can pick it up on these phone images, but what's happening when you paint the boat upside down is the paint has a tendency to build up just a little bit more in the space between the planks, the overlap. And what's happened is it's filled it in. I don't even have to sand it. It's almost perfectly smooth because the paint continues to just flow out beautifully. I've never worked with this kind of paint before. It's been a new experience for me, and it's quite satisfying. I don't know if you can see from this phone image, but the paint job for a job that's done with a brush or a foam brush, it's about as good as I could possibly imagine. So this is where I am now, coat 4. I've got 1 more to go, and then I'm finished. Well, folks, if you're still with me, I've finished now, finally, coat number 5 of the white single part polyurethane. This is 5 coats, and I'm done. As you can see, there's a tremendous gloss to the paint. That's the good news. Part of the bad news is that the tremendous gloss and the ultra smooth finish will reveal even the tiniest little flaw. So I've been working on that quite a bit. You can see here that I've got a nice sharp line underneath the boat between the hull and the outrail. And I wanted to point out to you that I do that using this Home Depot frog tape that you may be familiar with, the green stuff. It seems to have some chemical in the adhesive that gives you an especially good seal. Also, toward the end of the project, I wound up using 320 paper, which is super fine, but I found out even that is abrasive enough, and because the paint is so thin and so glossy, you can still see the sanding marks if you look just right. So after that, I finished up the last 2 coats with this, which is the standard Scotch-Brite green scouring pad. This is approximately equivalent to a 600 grit, and it gives you a nice sanding effect, but the scratch marks are so small you can hardly see them. So again, I'll see if I can get a little bit closer here to show you. If you look carefully, you can see that all of the brush strokes, if you want to call them that, I have been using a foam brush, they haven't all completely disappeared, but it's really a beautiful finish. I'm quite happy with it. Another thing I wanted to point out, it's just a personal thing, but it's something that you might consider. You may notice that I've got the boat a little bit higher in the air than you might imagine. This is between waist high and chest high for me, and I find it's a lot easier to paint and sand at this level. I'm trying to do everything I can to minimize the bending over. So this is the result of 3 to 4 coats of clear epoxy on the wood, sanded heavily between each coat, then 4 coats of primer, sanded heavily between each coat, and now this is 5 finish coats. So it's quite a lot of work here in the bottom. To me, it's worth it. To other people, maybe it's a little bit overkill, but I'm happy with it. And I'll be moving on to the inside. I'll be varnishing the interior. I know some people just hate to varnish, but it's one of the things that I enjoy most, so I've saved the best for last. But the bottom is now completely painted and finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this series of 2 videos actually on painting the bottom. It's a little boring, but here's where it all comes together and you wind up with a beautiful finished product. So thanks a lot for watching. Again, I'd be glad to listen to your comments and maybe try to answer a couple of questions. Feel free to put those on the YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next time. Bye-bye.